Okay, everyone. Hello, it's Takuya here, and yes, I know it has been a while. I apologize, things have gotten extensively busy, but I am getting back into the swing of things. Just to cover what has happened personally a bit for me here, my father-in-law has had some health issues, and so each morning, instead of working on any of my content, I have been taking him to the hospital, and this is something that has now been cleared. We are all good. So what this means is that I am back to making content. I am back to making content every morning, which I will be religiously pursuing, particularly for those who are supporting me on Patreon, which, if you see the title of this video, if you see what it is in it, this is something that, as a shout out, I am putting in. This particular video is dedicated to Tuna. Thank you very much for your support on Patreon. I will be reaching out to other supporters on there as well, and I will be developing something in my Discord where my patrons are able to reach out to me to suggest video ideas and what it is that they want. We're still working a lot of those systems out for what we plan to employ, but besides that, let's get into the meat of today's video. So what I'm going to talk about, and this is going to be an extended series as I love the idea of doing this as a podcast, but I specifically wanted to talk about the military history of the presidents of the United States, which we don't really have all that many that were great military men. Past a certain point, during times of conflict, it is expected that the leader, the one who is the commander-in-chief of the military of the American Republic, that this is something that they would or should at least have military experience. That did not always pan out to be. I say that, but the topic of today's video, what we're going to really start with, is George Washington. Because there's a bit of meme when it comes to George Washington and military history. They have a tendency to do one of two things. George Washington is either lionized as this brilliant military tactician, an absolute god amongst men, or he was just kind of a mediocre bad commander. But the story of George Washington is something that it's a lot more complex than what we give him credit for. And so today I wanted to cover a little bit of the military history of George. Not just George Washington, the president. Not just George Washington, the leader of the American Revolution. I want to talk a bit about George Washington before the American Revolution and George Washington after the American Revolution. Because his history as a military commander did not end with the American Revolution. It actually went on for quite a bit longer. So, first off, the pre-American Revolution history. George Washington was born in America. He was the son of a wealthy family, though his father did die when he was young, at that point only about 11 years old. And this stopped any hope of him going to school in England, and instead his family had to focus on continental efforts. And at the same time, his mother did not want him to go to the Navy. So, what did he do? Well, he joined the militia. Washington's official career in the military began in 1752 when George DeWindy appointed him as the district adjutant of the militia at the rank of major. Keep in mind, he didn't have any military experience here at the time, and he was appointed to the role of major. The governor recognized that even though Washington was young, he did have ability. He was intelligent. He did know how to organize troops. He was a good speaker at this point in time. And so he observed that George Washington was efficient, dependable, and already quite courageous. He was very eager to make a name for himself. Considering his family circumstances, there was every indication that George had to both be successful in the military and as a businessman. This was something that absolutely he had to do. During this time, the French and the English were both determined to gain ownership of the Mississippi, and by this time it is the early 1750s, and it is George Washington that would directly lead us into the French and Indian War. So, as I said, during this time, the French and the English were both determined to gain ownership of the Mississippi River Valley. It soon became obvious, however, that a military conflict was brewing. Something was about to break out. And so, in an attempt to avoid said conflict, the governor sent Major George Washington with a letter to the French, who were occupying the claimed territories that England had claimed through the Ohio country, to leave. Just get out, please. We don't want to fight. Just leave. And this was subsequently refused. And George was instead then sent in with a group of men with Native American allies to force the French out. Now, the initial idea was that there may be some casualties, but it was never intended necessarily to kill the French. They wanted to simply drive them away, because you didn't want to necessarily risk all-out war and something escalating to something further. Or at least, that is the idea that we have behind it. Yet, while there is a conflicting story, when George Washington and his men and native allies came across a French force of about 30 soldiers, somehow or another, the French commander was killed. And as the story goes, this occurred when the leader of the Native American allies, which I will do a whole video on him because that's going to require an entire thing there, killed him and then subsequently devoured parts of his brain. Now, again, there's a lot of conflicting stories regarding this, and that is something that I think requires an entire video dedicated to it in and of itself. But yeah, that might have actually then happened. Anyway, you might know the story from there. War breaks out between the British and the French. George Washington and many other colonials serve in the British military as part of militia forces. And from this, they win. The British win, but at great cost. It tears their economy apart. And from this, in protecting the colonies, this of course then leads to a bunch of new taxes, rules, regulations, and other issues that then lead to the American Revolution. Now, that's obviously an oversimplification, but we all know then pretty much how the story goes from there. America gains its independence, and we are then an ally of the French. However, post-American Revolution, there is an interesting detail that happens that not nearly as many people are aware of, and that is the QuasiWar with France. At one point in time, America almost, under the table, went to war with France. And there is a whole little story behind this here. So essentially the gist of the Quasi-War was that during Washington's time as president, England and France had entered into a war with each other, and Washington had signed a neutrality agreement stating that he would not get involved in a war between the two countries. Later that year, France sought help with the Americans and sent an emissary to the United States against their neutrality statement. But here's where it gets tricky. Instead of the French sending an emissary directly to the capital, which was in Philadelphia at the time, they instead went to South Carolina and started privately recruiting privateers in order to raid English shipping. And this enraged Washington. This was denounced, any support to France was refused, and a controversial treaty, which was the Jay Treaty, with England was signed. And this is something that cleared up a lot of the kind of confusion that had occurred post-revolution, like what actually would be borders, trade regulations, etc. between the United States and England. Because for decades, things were pretty much in limbo between the two powers. So, once this occurred, the French were quite pissed off. They began harassing and raiding American vessels at sea, and during this time, John Adams was elected as president, and Washington retired to Mount Vernon. When the conflict began, John Adams reinstated George Washington as general, as commander-in-chief. John Adams also sent ambassadors, declared for 2 years that the French Navy interfered with the Americans, harassing and capturing American ships and Britain. The Quasi-War officially ended in 1800, but this was a conflict that, while not fully breaking out into a war, did actually see George Washington in his old age, over a decade past the American Revolution. In fact, at that point, almost 2 decades past the American Revolution, actually take military command against the former French allies. That happened. Anyway, I know that this was a short little video and I want to do something a bit more in-depth. This was pushing content out fairly quick, and I want to know your suggestions for what more should be covered, what more should be done. I'm going to be making a lot more content here. I'm putting a lot more time here into editing. Let me know what it is that you think, and I will see you all here again next time. Thank you, and have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.